Imagine waking up 3,000 years ago, in a world without electricity, cars, phones, or modern machines. For an ordinary Egyptian, the rising sun was the beginning of another working day. Outside, an entire village was already beginning to stir. There was no long morning routine. Work was waiting. A simple meal gave workers the energy they needed for the hours ahead. Khaem stepped outside and began his walk toward the fields. Beside him flowed the river that made Egyptian civilization possible. The Nile turned the land around it into fertile fields. But fertile land did not mean an easy life. Harvesting required hours of physical work, usually done with simple tools. There were no machines to take the burden from his hands. Every bundle had to be gathered, carried, and stored. The harvest then began its journey from the fields into storage. Stored grain was essential for feeding communities through changing seasons. And someone had to keep track of how much grain was coming in. This simple harvest was connected to a much larger system of administration. By midday, the Egyptian heat could make even a short rest feel precious. But not everyone spent the day in the fields. For some, the Nile itself was their workplace. Fishing provided another important source of food for communities along the river. For Khaem, however, the working day was far from over. Water had to be directed carefully so crops could continue to grow. In Egypt, managing water was closely connected to survival. While workers labored outside, everyday life continued inside the village. Bread was one of the foundations of the Egyptian diet. Depending on wealth and location, meals could include vegetables, fruit, fish, and other local foods. When people needed something they did not produce themselves, they could turn to trade and exchange. Craftsmen produced the pottery, tools, containers, and objects that made daily life possible. Other workers turned plant fibers into linen clothing suited to Egypt's hot climate. As the afternoon slowly faded, Khaem returned to the work that had started with sunrise. But as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the hardest part of the day was finally coming to an end. Children in ancient Egypt had their own world of games, simple toys, and exploration. Their childhood was very different from ours today. From an early age, children could learn by watching older family members. Practical skills were often passed from one generation to the next. After a long day of work, returning home meant something important, being reunited with family. An Egyptian home was more than a place to sleep. It was where families cooked, worked, taught their children, and shared everyday life. As the afternoon disappeared, the intense heat began to soften. The village slowly prepared for the quieter hours of evening. Khaem had spent most of the day working in the fields. Now, his tools could finally be put aside until tomorrow. The evening meal was a chance for the family to gather together. Simple foods could become an important part of family life. Ancient Egyptians also made time for music and celebration. Even after difficult work, entertainment remained part of their lives. Games offered another way to relax. People could gather together, compete, and enjoy themselves after the day's work was finished. Religion was everywhere in ancient Egypt. Great temples stood as powerful symbols of a civilization deeply connected to its gods. Inside the temples, priests performed rituals surrounded by enormous columns, carved images, and walls covered with ancient writing. Religious life was not limited to enormous temples. Families could also keep small sacred objects and make offerings inside their homes. When darkness covered the village, Khaem could look upward and see a sky filled with thousands of stars. Without electric lights, the night sky was far more visible. The stars were an important part of how ancient people understood their world. There were no glowing streets or electric lamps. After sunset, small flames and moonlight were the main sources of light. Inside the home, the family slowly became quiet. After a long day, there was little reason to stay awake for very long. Before sleeping, Khaem placed his farming tool where he would find it again the next morning. Soon, the house became silent. Khaem slept on a simple reed mat, ready to begin another demanding day after sunrise. While Khaem slept, the Nile continued flowing through the darkness, connecting countless villages across ancient Egypt. This was only one small part of a much larger civilization, filled with farmers, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, scribes, and priests. These ordinary people performed thousands of different tasks. Together, their daily work kept Egyptian society functioning. Khaem would probably never become famous. Yet his work, repeated day after day, was essential to the survival of his community. Behind Egypt's famous temples and monuments were countless workers whose names history would never remember. and then the sun rose again. Another morning arrived, bringing another cycle of work beside the eternal Nile. For Khaem, the new day looked much like the previous one. His tools were ready, the fields were waiting, and the river still flowed. Days became months, months became years, and generations followed one another. The same river continued to shape their lives. Eventually, thousands of years passed. Villages disappeared, buildings collapsed, and the people who once lived there became distant memories, yet fragments of their world survived. Temples, tools, paintings, pottery, and written records still give us glimpses of their lives. Behind every monument was a human story. People woke, worked, ate, raised families, worshipped, celebrated, rested, and dreamed. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of ancient Egypt. Not only how its kings lived, but how ordinary people made an extraordinary civilization possible. If you want to discover more fascinating stories from history, follow or subscribe, and join us for the next journey into the past.